So, Digby, getting back to the week's news, the big story this week, in the absence of Donald Trump as he was overseas with all sorts of his aides and advisors and their spokespeople, and Jared and Ivanka were there. God knows how many business deals they were making when they were abroad, selling jewelry and whatnot, real estate. Who knows? But while the president was absent, it was revealed by four sources, I think it was. Two were current officials and two were former officials. So it's unclear that Donald Trump had spoken to the head of the CIA, or the director of national intelligence, and the head of the CIA, to basically lean on Comey and get Comey to either stop the investigation or for them to come out publicly and announce that the investigation was not real, or they hadn't found anything, or there was no collusion. This, of course, coming on the heels of Donald Trump having told Russia that Comey was nuts, and this is going to free him up. I mean, I bring this up just because what's clear is there is some massive leaking going on in the intelligence services, but there's also somebody in the White House who is in on what appears to be some of the most sensitive conversations, who is also leaking. And you wrote a piece about Donald Trump contemplating bringing Corey Lewandowski back. First of all, remind people who Corey Lewandowski is and why Trump might be now like just wondering like who here is out to get me as he looks around the guys, and I do mean guys, he's assembled in the Oval Office.
Well, I think we all know that Trump looks back on the campaign as really his glory days, the most outstanding, tremendous, fantastic, wonderful campaign that anyone's ever run. And in the early days, Corey Lewandowski, who he'd picked up somewhere along the line.
Digby, know he won the Electoral College.
Well, I hadn't heard that, but I do know it's very, very difficult for a Republican to win it. I have heard that.
Except for the last two Republicans who won the presidency,
all the ones
it's almost
who
impossible.
Don't win the popular vote. So he picked up Corey Lewandowski somewhere along the line, early days. And Lewandowski had been some, political hack in New Hampshire, I think. I don't think he'd ever done much. He was a former state trooper, I think. I mean, he wasn't like somebody who was a big deal in Republican politics, or at least not national politics. Anyway, they obviously formed a bond. And, he looks back on those days with great fondness. And Lewandowski, I think he thinks, was truly loyal to him. And during the campaign, he butted heads with first Paul Manafort, and then I believe he butted heads with Javanka, with Jared and Ivanka, and he ended up getting fired after a bunch of controversies where he was roughing up protesters, he assaulted a reporter, he was speaking out of turn. I mean, he was really a very amateurish campaign manager, and they brought in, Kellyanne Fitzpatrick, Kellyanne Conway, and David Bossie and that whole crew, even after they fired Paul Manafort. In any case, Lewandowski, I think he really believes he is a true friend. I think Trump believes that, and he has evidently been in contact with him throughout this whole time, even though he was fired. Lewandowski, so the talk is that he's going to be brought in for crisis management, which I think is kind of funny, because Lewandowski causes crises. He doesn't
exactly
solve them. But I think it's just a matter of exactly what you said. Trump doesn't know who to trust. And, that's actually quite wise of him because, as you say, somebody in there is leaking like a sieve, and it's probably all of them. I mean, I would guess that this is all this, Trump has set this up as rivalries. And they're trying to take out each other, and that probably includes Jared and Ivanka and his closest allies. Are leaking this stuff to hurt other members of the administration, and what it ends up with is just this free-for-all, as well as the intelligence community, the FBI, everybody else in the government is leaking like sieves too.
And we should also include in that Mike Pence. I mean, there was some very timely stories this past week about how Mike Pence, he's not aware of anything that's going on in the White House.
Of course not. He's completely oblivious, isn't he? He has no clue.
Well, yeah, it's not that he's oblivious. He pays a lot of attention, but they have kept him out of the loop specifically. So he's almost like there, but not really there. And,
right, but he's very competent. Don't ever forget that, because he's
indeed.
Really
if ever he needed, if the country ever needed him to step in, he could. I think
he'd be totally prepared.
Exactly, and it seems to me that when the transcript of Comey is a nut, or I've leaked intel information to the Russians. I mean, maybe that came from McMaster's, but I don't see what value it has to a guy like McMaster's, right? I mean, who
benefits, right?
Who benefits from that type of situation? It seems to me now, again. We can't, I don't even think that we're capable of calculating who benefits from this, because we don't know just how crazy they think he is there. So, I mean, I could come up with a scenario that it's McMaster's, even though he's out there defending the president and denying it, because maybe it's the only way he could communicate to the president, like, you're not supposed to do that. I mean, who knows?
I could see that.
A guy like Lewandowski definitely has, projects that image of like, I'm going to protect you. I mean, you remember he would like rough up reporters who would go near Trump. And I think that's what Trump probably finds so attractive about that guy.
I'm sure.
You wrote, do you think, does he really think thuggish Corey Lewandowski can save him? I think the thuggish, when Trump looks at him and sees a thug, I think that's a feature, not a bug of Corey Lewandowski.
Absolutely. And it also explains the other guy that is being named, which is David Bossie. And David Bossie is a different animal than Lewandowski. He's very much a Republican insider from way, way back, going back to the 90s. And his main claim to fame was he is a professional Clinton character assassin, both Clintons. And he has spent a lifetime, his entire career doing that. In fact, he founded a group called Citizens United, which, as we know, turned into a very famous court case unleashing gushers of money into the political system. And the case was about a film that he'd made about Hillary Clinton, and it had been restricted from being broadcast during a certain period. It ended up in the Supreme Court, and the result of that case was the unleashing of all this money. So that is what David Bossie does. That's why he was brought into the campaign at the end of the presidential campaign as they went into the fall. I think he was hired in September. He came out of a super PAC that had been put together by the Mercers, and Bannon and Kellyanne Conway was involved. In any case, Bossie has a very specific job, and his job is to create scandals. Now, that's not going to help Trump necessarily, but I think the idea might be that he can provide distraction and deflection. And if you look at some of the stuff that's just bubbling up from wherever, including perhaps from the Russian government, things like this Seth Rich scandal, stuff like Pizzagate, all this crazy stuff that's churning on the right, there may be some thought, and I'm giving Trump way more credit for actual strategy here than just impulse, but there may be some thought from somebody that Bossie could perform a particular function in keeping the right wing engaged and on Trump's side by churning this kind of stuff out. That's my theory anyway. I don't know why else you'd want that guy in there. Now, it should be
I don't know why he needs to do that from the White House, though. But
I don't think he's going to be in the White House. I think from what I understood, they're going to create an outside war room, which is really weird, but it gives them a little distance, I think, from the White House. I don't know. This is all sort of rumor.
Interesting point. All right, well, let's take a break, and when we come back, let's talk about that Seth Rich story, which was fascinating in a myriad of ways. We got to take a quick break. I'm Sam Seder. This is Ring of Fire Radio. We'll be right back with Heather Parton, or you may know her as Digby. We'll be right back.